I remember the day Aunt Carol came to visit. It was a day of relentless, suffocating humidity, the kind that made the air feel thick and sticky like cheap molasses. I was sitting on the sagging front porch swing, the one with the missing chain link I'd promised myself I'd fix 6 months ago, sipping lukewarm iced tea, trying to pretend the oppressive heat wasn't slowly dissolving my will to live. That porch, that entire house, was my sanctuary. But to the rest of my family, especially Aunt Carol, it was simply the shack. My inheritance, a century-old structure tucked away on 2 acres of dense, overgrown forest land that nobody else wanted. It wasn't picturesque. The paint was peeling in strips like sunburnt skin. The roof shingles resembled jagged teeth, perpetually threatening collapse. The front door was a tired, dark green monstrosity, warped by decades of sun and rain, which always needed a solid shoulder check to properly close. But it was mine. After years of bouncing between cramped apartments and expensive rent, the shack, with its deep-set windows and uneven floorboards, represented freedom and permanence. It was quiet, and it held the ghosts of my family's past, and I liked that. I had very little money, having used the bulk of my small inheritance just to secure the land taxes and pay for essential plumbing repairs. So fixing it up had been a slow, agonizing process. Most days, I felt less like an owner and more like a tenant of a benevolent, slightly decrepit historical monument. I heard the engine before I saw the car. Aunt Carol doesn't drive. She commands a vehicle, specifically a pristine, obsidian black Mercedes SUV that looked ludicrously out of place, navigating the rutted, dusty gravel drive leading up to my house. The vehicle pulled up with a theatrical crunch of tires on gravel, and the driver, her latest overly muscled personal assistant, scrambled out to open her door. Aunt Carol emerged like a queen stepping onto dry land, her silk dress immaculate, her posture rigid, a stark contrast to the wilted wildflowers surrounding my porch steps. She didn't look at me first. She looked at the house, and the look on her face was a masterpiece of barely contained disgust, a blend of pity and utter horror. "Oh, darling," she began, her voice a low, breathy rasp that somehow still managed to project judgment across the lawn. She didn't hug me. She didn't even offer a polite, "How are you?" She just stood there, her expensive leather handbag clutched like a weapon, her gaze sweeping over the house with clinical disapproval. "I tried to tell your mother not to leave this eyesore to you. But stubbornness, I suppose, runs deep in our line, doesn't it?" I felt the familiar, hot prickle of defensiveness rise in my throat, but I forced a smile. "It's structurally sound, Aunt Carol. Just needs a little TLC." She took a cautious step onto the porch, making sure her Louboutin heel didn't touch anything that looked too suspiciously antique. "TLC? Honey, this needs a bulldozer and a prayer. Look at this wood. It's practically composting. The windows are so old I can practically see the 1930s looking back at me. And this railing," she poked the splintered wooden railing with the tip of her perfectly manicured finger. "It's a liability. Someone is going to fall and sue us all." Her shaming wasn't subtle. It was a targeted, laser-focused critique aimed at making me feel inadequate, a running commentary on the deficiencies of my life choices. Aunt Carol had always measured success by square footage and market value, and by her metrics, I was a spectacular failure living in a slum. She detailed the list of repairs that would cost more than the house was worth: the foundation, the wiring, the leaky cistern in the basement I'd been avoiding, the lack of central air conditioning, a mortal sin in this climate. Honestly, she used my name then with an emphasis that made it sound like an admonishment. "You're a smart young person. Why are you wasting your potential playing country mouse in this dilapidated cottage? It's embarrassing. When people ask where you live, what do you even tell them? Do you just say the old shack and pray they don't ask for pictures?" She sighed, an exasperated sound that spoke volumes about the cross she had to bear, being related to someone so utterly lacking in ambition. "You need to sell the lot. Take whatever pittance you can get for the land, demolish the eyesore, and buy yourself a clean, modern condo, a place where things work, a place you won't be ashamed to invite people to." The word ashamed hit me hard, sinking past my defenses. I had always been proud of carving out a space for myself, but hearing it articulated so coldly, so judgmentally, made me question everything. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was clinging to a ruin out of sentimentality and self-sabotage. Maybe the dusty, worn charm I saw was just a symptom of deferred maintenance and poverty. She handed me a crisp, unsolicited business card, a property developer she knew, and told me to call him immediately. "He'll give you a fair price for the dirt, and trust me, that's all you're really selling here," she concluded, dusting off her hands as if she had just cleaned the entire porch. With that final, devastating pronouncement, she made her retreat, leaving behind the faint, expensive scent of designer perfume, a scent that smelled suspiciously like condescension. I watched the black SUV disappear down the drive, kicking up a plume of dust that slowly settled back onto the withered hydrangeas. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I felt a cold, determined resolve settle in my gut. I looked at the house, not with affection, but with a critical, almost hostile eye, seeing it through Aunt Carol's lens. Dilapidated cottage, eyesore, shameful. It was the shaming, the utter certainty in her voice that this place was worthless, that finally spurred me into action. I had been planning to tackle the repairs slowly, but now a new, more immediate impulse took over. I needed to prove her wrong, not just about the house's structural integrity, but about its value. Maybe not market value, but something else, something hidden, something that would justify my choice to stay. I stood up, pushing off the porch railing, the one she'd declared a liability, and walked back inside, the heat of the afternoon suddenly irrelevant. The sheer age of the house was its defining feature. It was built somewhere around 1890, a time when craftsmanship was often prioritized over speed. As I looked around the dim living room, past the threadbare rug and the cheap second-hand couch, I focused on the built-in elements. The heavy, dark wood trim around the doorways. The curiously narrow, steep staircase leading up to the second floor. The mantel over the unused fireplace, carved with a pattern I had always dismissed as generic. I walked over to the old, wall-mounted phone nook, a relic long since abandoned, and ran my hand over the slightly indented, smooth wood. It had a weight, a density that modern materials simply lacked. I suddenly realized I had never actually investigated the house. I had only lived in it. I knew the electrical panel was dodgy, and the plumbing occasionally gurgled ominously, but I knew nothing of its provenance, the story of the hands that had built it, or why my great-grandparents had been so insistent on keeping it in the family, despite its lack of modern amenities. Aunt Carol wanted me to sell the land and bulldoze the house. But what if the house itself wasn't the impediment to value, but the source of it? What if, buried beneath the peeling paint and the accumulated dust of a century, there was a secret that even the snobbiest, most materialistic relative couldn't ignore? I knew then that I wouldn't call the property developer. I needed a second opinion, a specialized opinion, someone who could see past the shabbiness to the substance. My initial plan was to prove the house wasn't a liability. My new, more urgent mission, fueled by a potent cocktail of spite and curiosity, was to find evidence that it was something much, much better. I needed to dig into the past, to look beyond the surface of the old shack that had just shamed me, and find the truth hidden within its old bones. I began my search right there in the living room, focusing on the oldest, most ignored piece of furniture, a heavy, dark mahogany cabinet tucked awkwardly into a corner, its glass door opaque with age and grime. This was where I would start. The mahogany cabinet was the deepest kind of black-brown, practically absorbing the meager light filtering through the grimy windows. It was so heavy that even nudging it left scorch marks on the old pine floorboards. My grandmother had always used it to store dusty photo albums and tangled Christmas lights, so I assumed its contents were equally mundane. I wrestled the heavy, keyless latch open, the lock long since broken, and was instantly hit by the smell of aged paper, dried cedar, and something faintly metallic like old pennies. Tucked beneath the clutter, at the very bottom, was a wooden box. Not a fancy, velvet-lined jewelry box, but a simple, dovetailed pine box, the kind a craftsman would use for tools. It was heavy, and when I lifted the lid, I didn't find jewels, but something far more valuable in that moment: answers. Inside lay a stack of yellowed, brittle paper and a small, leather-bound journal. The papers were old building invoices and deeds, dated mostly between 1888 and 1892. The original owner wasn't just my great-great-grandfather. He was listed on a few of the documents as Elias Thorne, master joiner, and cabinet maker. That immediately changed the narrative. The house wasn't built by a simple country bumpkin throwing up 4 walls. It was the personal residence and workshop of a highly skilled artisan. I realized then that every piece of heavy wood trim, every intricate curve of the stair railing, and even the slightly ornate mantelpiece was his personal handiwork, his calling card. This wasn't just a house. It was a century-old portfolio. I started on the journal. Thorne's handwriting was elegant and precise, detailing his work and his life. He wrote about the struggle of finding quality, old-growth timber, about his pride in crafting pieces that would outlast the whims of fashion and the rapacity of time. He described the house itself not as a dwelling, but as the frame, a structural showpiece where he could test his most advanced techniques. He wrote about a secret project, something he called his stone heart, designed to be permanently built into the home structure, a piece that would defy age and fire. He never explicitly said what the stone heart was, but the entries detailing its creation were meticulous, almost obsessive. That was the moment the shaming evaporated, replaced by a thrilling sense of vindication. Aunt Carol hadn't just insulted a dilapidated cottage, she had dismissed a master craftsman's legacy. The journal also held the key to the next step. Tucked between the pages was a newspaper clipping, a review from an obscure local arts paper from the early 1900s, praising an exhibit of Elias Thorne's furniture. The reviewer mentioned that Thorne had studied under a prominent American furniture designer of the late 19th century, a man named Julian Vance, who was known for blending traditional European artistry with nascent American modernism. The article lamented that much of Thorne's work remained hidden, built into the fabric of his own residence. The clipping also had a note scribbled on the margin, not Thorne's handwriting, but my grandmother's, years later. Call Vance's great-grandson, the antique specialist. He'll know the style. I had never thought to look for an antique specialist for a house, only a contractor or a realtor. But this wasn't about the cost of copper piping. It was about the artistry of the bones. I typed Julian Vance Antique Specialist into the search bar. The results were immediate. Julian Vance IV was not only a renowned expert in 19th century Americana and architectural antiques, but he was also a frequent appraiser on one of those popular valuation shows, known for his eccentric bow ties and brutally honest assessments. His specialty, pre-Victorian domestic structures that often contained built-in architectural pieces. The connection was too specific to be a coincidence. My great-great-grandfather, a master joiner, trained by the namesake of the man I was about to call. This was destiny, fueled by my aunt's cruelty. I located his professional contact information, and with a sudden surge of adrenaline that made my hand tremble, I drafted the email. I kept the tone purely professional, describing the house's approximate age, the original builder's name, Elias Thorne, master joiner, and the reference to his mentor, Julian Vance IV. I included a quick, blurry photo of the fireplace mantel, the only piece of interior woodwork I thought looked remotely impressive. I didn't mention my Aunt Carol or the Old Shack nickname. I just presented the facts, framing the house as a potential research interest, a time capsule of the Vance School of Design. I hit send, instantly regretting the impulsive nature of the contact, the fear that he would laugh at my dilapidated, heat-soaked ruin. The immediate relief after sending the email was quickly replaced by a restless energy. Waiting was impossible. I returned to Thorne's journal, determined to find the location of the stone heart. Thorne was meticulous, but also cryptic. He wrote of placing the heart where the wood grain of the vertical structure met the bedrock, a piece of permanence in a world of passing fashion. This description brought me to the ground floor, specifically the narrow space beneath the staircase. I had always assumed the wall paneling there was decorative, nailed flush to hide the undersides of the treads. But I now examined it with Thorne's words in mind. The wood here was darker, denser, and the grain pattern seemed to flow unnaturally, twisting in a way that mimicked marble. I ran my hands over the wall, searching for a seam or a latch, anything that would indicate a false panel. It took 10 minutes of pressing, tapping, and pulling, until my fingers landed on a small, nearly invisible indentation near the floorboard. Applying firm pressure, I felt a slight click, and a section of the paneling, about 3 feet tall and 1 foot wide, smoothly slid inward and then sideways, revealing a shallow, dark recess in the wall. It wasn't a cubbyhole or a hiding spot for treasure. It was a perfectly constructed, stone-lined chamber. And in the center of the chamber, built into the wall with mortar that looked centuries old, was a stone. It wasn't a jewel or a relic. It was a massive, perfectly carved block of dark gray soapstone about the size of a microwave oven. The stone was unadorned, save for a single, small plaque of tarnished brass screwed into its face. The plaque was engraved with 4 deeply cut words: Elias Thorne, his foundation. The block was placed precisely where the wall met the house's granite foundation, literally merging the craftsmanship of the house with the bedrock of the earth. Thorne's stone heart was a structural, artistic statement of permanence, not just a decorative element. It was a functional monument to his skill. The soapstone itself was unnervingly cool to the touch, a strange geological anchor in the humid wooden house. I realized that if this specialized material was built into the home's structure, what else was hidden beneath the surfaces? The house wasn't just old, it was built like a vault. My excitement now overshadowed my anger, and I knew Aunt Carol's pittance would soon look ridiculous. The 2 days that followed sending the email to Julian Vance IV felt longer than the entire summer combined. Every shadow the old house cast seemed laced with doubt. I'd check my phone every 5 minutes, not for a notification, but just to make sure the email hadn't bounced back or that I hadn't somehow hallucinated the entire exchange. My fear wasn't just rejection, it was validation of Aunt Carol's cruel assessment. If the world's leading expert in 19th century Americana simply ignored my plea, then the stone heart was just an oddly placed rock, and the master joiner was just an old man with too much time on his hands. The shack would remain the shack, and I would remain the family embarrassment. I kept rereading Aunt Carol's last text message, a one-word admonishment after she left. Think. The sheer weight of that single word was designed to crush my confidence. But on the 3rd morning, right as I was contemplating calling the property developer, out of sheer panicked exhaustion, the notification flashed: Julian Vance IV, Elias Thorne residence. My heart did a quick, nauseating flip. I opened it, hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The email was terse, professional, and crucially, non-dismissive. Vance thanked me for the inquiry, stating that the connection between Thorne and his great-grandfather, Julian Vance I, was a little documented but historically significant footnote. He admitted that while he normally only dealt with detached furniture, the reference to Thorne's structural integration was intriguing. He hadn't scoffed. He was intrigued, but he needed more. He required specific, high-resolution photographs of 4 things: the construction details of the soapstone block, Thorne's stone heart, the distinctive joinery where the wall panels met the floorboards, the corner where the kitchen cabinet met the ceiling beams, and most importantly, the underside of the heavy mahogany cabinet I'd found the journal in. He explicitly warned me, do not attempt to remove or detach anything. I am looking for signatures of technique, not portability. The rest of the day turned into a sweaty, dusty amateur photo shoot. The old house, which was already dim, became a challenge in lighting and focus. I used every pillow, lamp, and flashlight I owned to try and illuminate the intricate, almost invisible bevels and dovetails Thorne had used. I had to contort myself into painful positions beneath the kitchen sink and crawl on my belly to capture the precise point where the staircase riser met the main beam. As I worked, I stopped seeing dust and dirt. I started seeing work. I noticed the minute imperfections that proved the pieces were hand-cut, and the impossible precision of the joints that had held firm for over 100 years without nail or screw. I saw why Thorne called himself a master joiner. The house was essentially a giant, interlocking puzzle box designed to withstand time and shift with the weather without falling apart. When I finally managed to crane my phone camera under the mahogany cabinet, I saw what Vance was looking for. Etched into the base of the cabinet, near the rear left leg, was a small, unmistakable mark. A stylized compass rose with a tiny, nearly microscopic T in the center. It was Thorne's signature, his mark of quality, perfectly preserved because it was hidden from light and wear. I snapped the picture and sent the entire, heavily compressed folder of photos back to Vance, adding a detailed description of the soapstone block and its plaque. The second response was fast. Less than 4 hours later, and it wasn't an email, but a phone call from an unknown New York number. Julian Vance IV's voice was exactly as I had imagined, crisp, authoritative, and radiating professional enthusiasm. "I've seen the images," he said, bypassing introductions entirely. "And I need to be blunt. The soapstone block is fascinating. It speaks volumes about his artistic philosophy. But it's the joinery of the main structure that gives me pause. And that cabinet. The mark is authentic, no question. That cabinet is an Elias Thorne original, executed in his mature style, possibly one of the earliest pieces he made post-apprenticeship with my great-grandfather. It is, unequivocally, an antique of significance." I leaned against the wall, adrenaline thrumming through my veins. "Significance? Can you put a number on that?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. There was a slight pause on the line. "For the cabinet alone, assuming documentation proves provenance, we are likely looking at a starting auction estimate of between $12,000 and $15,000. But that's not why I called. That cabinet is a detachable artifact. What is truly unprecedented is the structure you are living in." He then went on to explain his initial theory. Thorne wasn't just building a house. He was creating a demonstration model, a physical treatise on joinery that employed techniques thought to be lost or too time-consuming for residential construction of that era. He believed the house itself might be one of the few completely intact, architecturally unmolested examples of the Vance School applied to a full-scale dwelling. This was far beyond the $15,000 cabinet. The cabinet was just the decoy. The house was the prize. I am willing to fly down next week to perform a full architectural assessment, but I must warn you, this is a major undertaking. I will not be valuing the land or the fixtures. I will be valuing the structure. I will be assessing it as a unique piece of American architectural history. And for that, you need to understand the value jumps exponentially. I'm interested in whether this house can be entered into the National Register of Historic Places, not whether it needs new siding. The gravity of his words settled over me, heavy and exhilarating. This was no longer just about getting back at Aunt Carol. It was about protecting a piece of history. I immediately agreed to his visit, but before we hung up, Vance delivered his final stern instruction, a chilling warning that brought the external world crashing back in. "You must tell absolutely no one about my visit, not your neighbors and certainly not your family," he stressed. "The kind of integrity this house may possess, the kind of value we are discussing makes it a target. Speculators, architectural salvagers, and thieves. If word leaks out that there is a highly valuable, historically significant antique structure sitting relatively unprotected, your safety and the integrity of the house could be compromised. This house is a vault of old wood, and right now, you hold the only key. You need to keep it locked." His words instantly reinforced the narrative of secrecy Thorne himself had created. The old shack had become a protected secret. I hung up the phone, the cheap plastic casing feeling heavy in my hand, and looked around my dusty living room. The light had changed again. This wasn't a rundown cottage. It was a potential treasure chest, and I had just been given a security briefing. The thought of Aunt Carol's judgmental face, her text message demanding I think, came back, but this time it fueled my determination to secrecy. I deleted her number entirely. I was officially in deep, protecting a $15,000 cabinet and an entire house whose value I still didn't dare to guess from the outside world. I had to focus on preparing the house for Vance's visit, and I knew exactly where to start. The forgotten, locked-off room in the attic that my family had always warned me never to enter. It was the only place I hadn't looked. Vance's warning about secrecy was a heavy blanket draped over the anticipation. The house, once just my quiet, dusty refuge, now felt like a stage, and I was perpetually looking over my shoulder, convinced every passing car was a potential speculator. But the secrecy also fueled a new determination. I had a week before his arrival, and I knew I couldn't wait. I needed to investigate the only remaining piece of the house that had been off-limits for generations, the locked attic room. My grandmother had always called it Thorne's Sanctuary, and strictly forbade entry, claiming it was full of unstable junk and dangerous tools. Located off the main cramped attic space, the door was heavy, solid oak, sealed by an exterior slide bolt and an interior skeleton key lock that hadn't turned in decades. The wood around the bolt was warped, but the lock itself, like everything else Thorne built, was stubbornly intact. After an hour of delicate work with a small lock-picking set I'd bought online for an unrelated project, the old tumbler clicked. The metallic sound echoed in the stale air, and I pushed the door open to an atmosphere so thick with age it felt solid. This was not junk storage. This was a master's abandoned workshop. Dust lay inches thick over everything, coating a long workbench covered in strange, specialized planes and chisels, some of which looked far too intricate for common carpentry. But the real treasure was resting on a three-legged drafting table near the single, grimy dormer window. Unrolled and brittle, held in place by two heavy cast-iron weights shaped like eagles, were the original architectural plans. Not just sketches, but detailed, hand-drawn blueprints of the entire residence, signed E. Thorne, Master Joiner. The plans confirmed everything Vance suspected. They detailed the complex dovetail and wedge interlocking system Thorne had used throughout the house, a system designed to allow the wood to contract and expand with the relentless humidity without compromising the structural load-bearing. It explained why the house had stood for a century with minimal shifting. But there was one section of the plan that stopped me cold: the kitchen. Beneath the flooring in what I now used as my pantry, Thorne had drawn a substructure, a complex array of crossbeams and structural supports labeled the bracing anchor. He had used an incredibly rare type of wood, identified in his spidery script as American chestnut. American chestnut. The tree species had been functionally wiped out by a blight in the early 20th century. If this house contained a major structural anchor made of intact, old-growth American chestnut, the value would not just be exponential, it would be museum-level priceless. This wood was the timber equivalent of a Fabergé egg. I spent the next 3 days meticulously cleaning the house, not covering up the age, but revealing it. I dusted the original plaster walls and carefully vacuumed the deep grain of the floorboards, trying to remove a century of grime without disturbing the patina. I didn't paint or modernize a single thing, understanding now that the house's value lay in its unmolested condition. The day Julian Vance IV arrived, the house smelled less of dust and more of old wood and quiet history. Vance pulled up in a nondescript rental car, alone, dressed impeccably in a tweed jacket despite the heat. He didn't waste a second on pleasantries. His eyes weren't focused on me, but on the corner joints of the porch railing. He moved through the house like a forensic scientist, his hands encased in thin white gloves, barely touching surfaces, but inspecting every seam and shadow with a professional eye loupe. He spent an hour on the mahogany cabinet, validating its provenance, then quickly moved on to the structure. "The integrity is stunning," he murmured, running his gloved fingertip along the doorframe of the living room, focusing on a corner where 3 pieces of wood met. "This is not common residential construction. This is shipbuilding methodology applied to a domestic dwelling." Thorne treated this house like a vessel meant to sail through time. The tension was already high when my phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number I recognized instantly: Aunt Carol's driver. I had deleted her contact, but the number was unmistakable. I let it go to voicemail, but seconds later, a text popped up. "Carol wanted to remind you about the property developer. He's ready to sign tomorrow. Don't be foolish. Are you seeing someone about repairs? Don't sink money into that ruin." The timing was deeply suspicious. Had she somehow guessed? Was she running surveillance? Vance was kneeling in the pantry, having just lifted a piece of loose floorboard to examine the substructure, and I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I quickly shoved the phone in my pocket. Vance emerged from the pantry, his face unreadable, but his eyes sparkling with a new intensity. "I need to see the attic," he stated, his voice low. "The bracing anchor, the system he used here, it's extraordinary. There must be an organizational structure to this madness." We ascended the cramped, steep staircase. I led him straight to the locked-off room, presenting the workshop and the drafting table. Vance gasped, a rare, genuine expression of shock. He went straight to the blueprints, tracing the American Chestnut support beam with a gloved finger. But then, his attention was drawn away by something else, the workbench. Elias Thorne wasn't just a joiner, Vance said, turning, his voice hushed. He was a cabinet maker who employed architectural techniques. But look here. He pointed to a small, heavy piece of equipment tucked beneath a dusty sheet on the workbench. It was a complex, beautiful tool made of brass and steel, unlike any hand tool I'd ever seen. This, Vance explained, is a custom-made profile gauge. Thorne used this to replicate the precise structural profiles found in the most exclusive, high-value homes of that era. He wasn't just building a house for himself, he was building a structural replica, an archive of priceless architectural details that were otherwise hidden behind plaster and lathe in Manhattan mansions. Vance's eyes widened, and he turned to me, the atmosphere suddenly electric. The $15,000 cabinet is a trinket compared to this. This house isn't just an archive of Thorne's work. It's an archive of the entire period's lost craftsmanship. Now, he said, tapping a section on the blueprint that showed a massive, central structural post hidden deep within the living room wall. I believe we need to assess the full, true value of the bracing anchor. I need to confirm the species of that wood. If that post is what I suspect it is, your old shack is about to become one of the most significant pieces of period architecture in the country, and based on this blueprint, I know exactly where to find the proof. Vance stood before the living room wall, right next to the massive hand-carved mantel I'd always taken for granted. He consulted the dusty blueprints from the attic, tracing a line from the bracing anchor symbol to the exact location where it should be hidden behind the plaster and lathe. The post is right here, he stated, tapping a spot near the corner where the wall met the fireplace hearth. This is the structural spine of the house, the core that holds the dovetailing secure. If Thorne used American Chestnut here, it means he committed an act of historical preservation even as he was building. He was making a statement about the permanence of truly great materials already becoming scarce, even in his lifetime. Removing the small section of the wall was the most nerve-wracking part of the day. Vance used surgical precision, carefully scoring the ancient plaster with a utility knife, moving slowly to avoid splintering any possible exposed wood. He pulled away a rectangular section of the lathing, and there it was, a colossal, unpainted, vertical timber post extending from the floor to the ceiling. It was enormous, far thicker than any modern 2x4, and its surface was dark, dense, and slightly reddish-brown. The wood grain was impossibly tight, revealing no knots or imperfections, a flawless, quarter-sawn specimen. Vance gently scraped a tiny sliver of the wood using a specialized tiny tool he kept in his tweed pocket. He examined it under his loupe, then, without a word, pulled out a small, portable chemical testing kit. The silence in the living room was absolute, broken only by the distant chirp of a bird and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I felt as though the entire century-old structure was holding its breath. Finally, Vance looked up. He didn't smile, but the intensity in his eyes was almost frightening. "It is," he whispered, his voice thick with professional awe. "It's old-growth American chestnut, untreated, unmolested, and structurally integral. The bracing anchor is entirely composed of the most coveted, resilient hardwood in North American architectural history. To find a piece this large, this intact, and this perfectly utilized in a residential structure is unprecedented. It's an anomaly. It's the kind of discovery that rewrites local architectural history." He stood up, brushing the dust from his trousers, and took a deep, deliberate breath. He then led me to the kitchen table, spreading out the blueprints, the cabinet photos, and his notes. The moment had arrived, the moment that would either confirm my vindication or leave me crushed under the weight of Aunt Carol's judgment. "We need to establish the valuation based purely on the structural and historical artifact status of this residence," Vance began, his tone now shifting from scholarly excitement to sober business. "We are not valuing the land. We are valuing the fact that you possess a unique, preserved architectural sample of the late 19th century Vance School, anchored by structural timber that is literally extinct. The cabinet is valued at $15,000, which is a bonus, but the house itself—" He paused, stacking his papers neatly. I leaned forward, my palms flat on the dusty tabletop. The market value for the land, as a lot for demolition, might be $50,000 in this region. But as an integrated, documented piece of architectural history, especially with the American Chestnut anchor and Thorne's documented joinery, we place a conservative, authenticated value on the structure itself. He looked me straight in the eye, finally delivering the number that would change everything. The structure, the house itself, is valued at $160,000. The number didn't feel real. It wasn't $1 million, but it wasn't the pittance Aunt Carol insisted on either. It was almost 4 times the market value of the land, an astronomical price for what everyone had dismissed as an old shack. It was vindication, delivered in a clear, decisive monetary figure. My eyes blurred, and a strange, choked sound escaped me, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and triumphant spite. She was wrong. They were all wrong. My home was a treasure. Vance watched my reaction, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial level. "And now we address your Aunt Carol." He pulled out his phone and showed me a quick search result, a tiny, obscure article from an online local history blog dated 3 months prior. The article mentioned an exhibition on early logging operations in the county and specifically referenced Elias Thorne's purchase of a huge quantity of high-grade American chestnut lumber just before the blight hit, a purchase deemed historically reckless at the time. "I did a little digging after your urgent email," Vance explained. "The only people who would have known about this particular historical note, this massive chestnut purchase, would be local historians, antiquarians, or descendants who still have documentation. Your Aunt Carol, in her zeal to get you to sell, may have inadvertently been tipped off," he continued, piecing together the true story behind the shaming. "I suspect she didn't know the full value. $160,000 is for preservation, not just materials. But she knew there was a historically valuable material somewhere inside this house. She wanted you to sell the land cheaply to her property developer friend, who would then pay her a substantial salvage fee for the wood and the structure. She wasn't just shaming you out of snobbery, she was shaming you into giving away an antique asset. Her motivation wasn't pity, it was calculated greed rooted in a piece of obscure historical knowledge. The realization was a punch to the gut. The shaming, the unsolicited business card, the suspicious text messages, it was all a cynical, predatory scheme. She wanted to bulldoze my sanctuary and profit from its unique, precious corpse. The $160,000 valuation wasn't just a number, it was a barrier against her betrayal. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice finally steady, now infused with cold fury. "You don't sell," Vance stated firmly. "You document. We immediately apply for landmark status. That protects the structure. It locks in this architectural valuation and makes any demolition attempt a federal offense. You are not living in a shack. You are living in a documented historical residence. You have gone from having no equity to having a protected, valuable asset. But you must proceed with caution and absolute secrecy. The moment the landmark application is filed, the fight to preserve it and the fight against your aunt begins." I looked at the old, dusty kitchen table, then at the wall hiding the priceless American chestnut post. I thought of Aunt Carol, pristine and judgmental in her Mercedes. The shame was gone, replaced by a steely, righteous anger. "We file the papers immediately," I told Vance. "And then, I think it's time for a family conversation." The following days were a blur of paperwork and hushed phone calls. Vance's team was incredibly efficient, prioritizing the documentation of the American Chestnut post and the submission of the application for the State Register of Historic Places. The moment the preliminary papers were filed, I felt the $160,000 value solidify into something tangible, something protected. It wasn't just my house anymore. It was the Elias Thorne residence, pending official recognition, and it was safe from bulldozers and predatory ants. The quiet vindication of protecting Thorne's legacy was powerful, but I knew the story wasn't complete until I faced the person who had tried to capitalize on my vulnerability. The confrontation came, not at a dramatic family meeting, but over a casual, carefully arranged phone call I initiated with Aunt Carol. I needed to control the narrative, and I needed to hear the denial in her voice. I called her under the pretext of discussing the sale of the property. "Aunt Carol," I started, keeping my voice flat and even, a conscious effort to mask the burning anger I felt. "I took your advice and had the property thoroughly appraised. I've decided against using your developer friend." There was a triumphant, smug pause on her end, the kind of silence that says, "Finally the child sees sense." "Well, that's wise, dear. Better to cut your losses. My friend will give you a quick cash close. What number did you settle on? I want to make sure you get enough for a decent down payment on something modern." "Oh, the land appraisal was low, just as you predicted," I admitted. "But the house itself, the structure was valued separately. It turns out that old wood you called composting is actually old-growth American chestnut. It's part of an intact 19th century architectural archive built by a master joiner. The house is being registered as a historical monument." The reaction was immediate and explosive, far surpassing my expectations. The composed, silky veneer of Aunt Carol's personality shattered instantly. "A monument? Don't be ridiculous. Who told you that nonsense? Some crackpot internet appraiser? That house is a fire hazard. You need to have the utilities shut off and sell the lot before it falls on you. That developer was offering you $45,000 for the whole lot. No questions asked, and you should take it." Her voice rose several octaves, losing its cultivated smoothness entirely. $45,000 for the lot, which contains $160,000 worth of antique architecture? I countered, letting the number hang in the air, a physical weight between us. Julian Vance IV valued the structure at $160,000. He's the leading expert on 19th century American architecture. He identified the joinery, the stone heart, and the American chestnut bracing anchor you were so keen to have salvaged quietly. "Did you really think I wouldn't look deeper after you shamed me for living in a piece of history?" The ensuing silence was heavy, wounded, and incriminating. Her calculated mask was gone. When she finally spoke, her voice was choked with a venomous mix of defeat and fury. "You dug that up just to spite me. It's a publicity stunt. That house is worthless and you know it. You are throwing away your life to cling to a ruin because you're poor and sentimental." "No, Aunt Carol," I said, finally allowing myself the satisfaction of true, righteous clarity. "I called the specialist because you called my home an embarrassment. I found out you weren't concerned with my well-being. You were trying to manipulate me into giving away $250,000 in assets for scrap value. You didn't want me to thrive. You wanted me to fail so you could strip mine my inheritance. And thanks to your calculated cruelty, I now own a piece of unique American architectural history. I'm not poor or sentimental. I'm the curator of the Elias Thorne residence. And I just made the house officially immune to your spiteful ambition." I didn't wait for her response. I hung up the phone, physically shaking, but feeling a catharsis I hadn't anticipated. The call was proof that her shaming was not an opinion. It was an attempt at theft, and I had won. In the months that followed, life in the old shack, which I now affectionately called the Thorne residence, transformed. I still lived simply, but with a profound sense of purpose. I secured grants related to historical preservation, which allowed me to conduct structural stabilization and historically accurate repairs. The peeling paint was replaced with a period-appropriate linseed oil finish, bringing out the true character of the clapboard. The place began to glow, no longer a ruin, but a proud monument. I set up a small digital library in Thorne's old workshop, archiving his journal and blueprints. I started a video blog documenting the restoration process, focusing on Thorne's techniques and the incredible integrity of the chestnut anchor. I was no longer ashamed of where I lived. I was fiercely, possessively proud. The house had stopped being a marker of my failure and had become a testament to my resilience and determination. Aunt Carol, predictably, attempted one last legal maneuver to challenge the title, claiming the discovery of the value constituted undue influence. but the solid documentation provided by Vance and the state's landmark filing shut her down immediately. She disappeared into bitter silence, the expensive perfume of her Mercedes never again polluting my gravel driveway. I often find myself sitting back on the old front porch swing, which I finally fixed, looking at the house with completely new eyes. She shamed me for living in the old shack, telling me it was worthless, a failure, an embarrassment. But her judgment was the catalyst. Without her cruel assessment, I never would have dug deep enough to find the proof. I never would have found Thorne's journal, the American Chestnut, or the official appraisal that valued my beloved run-down sanctuary at $160,000 for its history alone. She tried to crush me with shame, but instead, she forced me to discover the priceless treasure hidden within my foundation, proving that true value, like true strength, is almost always found deep inside the places the world dismisses. My home is old, it's quirky, and it's mine. And now, it's immortal.